Hello and welcome to Royale Without Cheese, our bi-weekly podcast in which we discuss both the classic and the unknown of art and popular cinema from the then and now. We are your hosts, me, Tomás Ferreira, Leonardo Miranda,
Hello.
hey, and Miguel Aido.
Hi there.
This is our talk show segment where we welcome grand indie filmmakers to our wonderful couch and discuss their work. Here with us we have Dwayne LeBlanc, an LA-based Caribbean-American artist and filmmaker, with his work primarily focused on themes of migration, visibility, and dual identity. We'll talk about his debut narrative short, Civic, an introspective film about homecoming, backed by Ghetto Film School through Netflix and developed by Berlinale Talent Shorts Form Station. With a great festival run, Civic made its international debut at the acclaimed International Film Festival Rotterdam and Clermont-Ferrand, playing now on the Criterion Channel. So, Dwayne, how are we feeling today?
Pretty good. Yeah, not bad.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we need to say congratulations on Civic for its many accolades. It won the Special Jury Recognition Prize at New Orleans Film Festival and also Best Mid-Length Short Film at Indie Memphis Film Festival, which was quite cool. And just for a little bit of context for the listeners, in Civic we have Booker, a young man who returns to his home after a long period of absence, driving around LA and meeting long lost friends. And the film we found was very beautiful and of an example of minimalist filmmaking in the way that its strength came very much from building over time an emotional resonance through the visuals and the performances. And it's a very personal film, being that the character is also Caribbean like yourself, and divided between these two worlds of being natural to someone who is away from home and connected to these questions of where do I belong, where am I going, am I still the same person, which I really related to as well, being kind of away from home for a while recently during my studies. So really, what we really want to ask for a head start is, were these feelings and questions something that you felt beforehand that inspired the film? Could you tell us about a little bit of the inception already of the film, and how, curiously enough, being such an intimate film, the co-writing process with your fellow writer Nicole Otero really pushed it further?
Yeah, man. Thank you for the introduction. And I just got a word that we were also just awarded Best Actor for Barrington Darius, who played Booker in the film, from the DTLA Film Festival, which was just this past weekend in Los Angeles. So, thank you for the recognition.
Cool.
Yeah, this idea, part of the reason why I feel like these themes of identity and migration and also visibility become so like integral or central to like my work and my process of thinking in films, is because of like my own personal identity and connection to being like a first gen, American. In this context, I think, you really feel a little bit of what it means to be like in a space like America, and not necessarily feeling American. And then when I'm going back home to my parents' country, in the Caribbean islands, there's also kind of a dislocation there where you don't feel wholly Caribbean. So in either context, I'm always kind of feeling a little bit of an outsider. And I think that not necessarily being a very, very unique point of view or perspective or connection. Sometimes, yeah, it has to do with geography. In my context, I guess it has to do with geography and cultural connection. So I think about that a lot in my work. So I think, yeah, when I was developing this idea about the film and how it was structured, this was a central part of like how I kind of accessed what this character, who is similar in a few ways to me, Booker. He's similar in a few ways, yes, being first generation, being from LA, and wondering about like how to kind of like communicate those thoughts and feelings within the film through the work.
And how was because what I found curious, the other kind of the second half of the question was, you felt the need for it to be a co-writing kind of partnership. How do you feel that helped further instead of, for example, it being a one writer mission, let's say?
Yeah, I think the co-writing element actually, it's interesting. I think any kind of collaboration in my eyes can add to the depth of a work, because essentially, if it comes from me, as in this example, if I was the only person authoring this, it would be kind of, or in cinematography or edit or any department in film especially. I think it diminishes the ability for it to be kind of like a universal truth. A little bit. It becomes more complicated to kind of access that. So I feel like in this particular situation, Nicole was such a great additive resource and she's a genius thinker, and without her, I think I wouldn't be able to have gotten to the depths of what character, like, I was speaking too centrally from my own perspective and point of view. So in this film, I think it really benefited, especially with certain scenes, like the closing scene where there is a perspective, of a female protagonist, or that I just wouldn't be able to access in a certain way just because I don't have that kind of perspective or connection. So yeah, those in those ways, I think collaboration I always embrace, for those reasons.
Yeah, it is particularly interesting, with very intimate projects. I tend to find that it is good to have another person with us as a writer, for example, because we tend to get into muddy waters of our own personal experience, particularly if the character has similarities with us. So we have a third person perspective here to talk with us. So that's interesting, what you say.
And yeah, and the short is entirely or mostly shot from inside Booker's car. And that
Mhm.
principle is, I found very effective in portraying both the sense, that permanent sense of displacement of the character, who's always moving through town, seeking some kind of self reassurance, looking for a feeling that he might have lost, looking for something. But also at the same time, the car is this source of warmth and togetherness with the friends, reminiscing and listening to music, having disagreements regarding the music. And so, that being said, what were some of the logistical challenges of filming inside and around the car, and how did you look to push the concept creatively?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think for me, like in my experience so far, without a structure, I don't want to say this, but I think title also comes around the time of structure. For some reason, there's already an idea there. There's already like a philosophy, or there's seeds of a film. What really kind of pushes it to the next level of structure. So what the film is shaped like, and I mean that like literally and metaphorically. In this case, I feel I wanted to tell, the car being such a liminal space, like this space that's very in between, means to get from one place to another, not necessarily looked at as a location, no, or a destination, I should say, not necessarily looked at as a destination, or but a means to one. I think those are the first sparks that got me thinking about why shooting in the car for this particular story, about what the theme is and the idea is of someone coming back to a place that became, that's home at one point, but now is a kind of a foreign place. I think it being like a road movie, so to speak, that isn't really traveling anywhere. It's like a road movie that doesn't go anywhere, I sometimes say, became a great, no pun intended, driving force to developing more of the script, and how the script and the materials of the film kind of work to communicate the idea. So logistically, it was very, very difficult. I mean, it has had a lot of challenges because of, again, like shooting a car is not the easiest thing in the world, to be honest with you. On paper, it might seem that way, but depending on how you want to go about it, what kind of story you're trying to tell, what the emotion of the camera needs to do, and all these different things become very challenging and very expensive very quickly. So, having limited budget, having limited resources, we had to figure out creative ways to um, still focus on the central themes and not abandon kind of the cinematic truth that we wanted to kind of pursue. There's a few things, meaning we had to find an identity for the camera. So my cinematographer, collaborator, and very dear friend of mine, Andrew, we kind of created this concept. We thought about the camera as what we call the ghost entity, which gave us an ability to think about the camera's perspective in a certain way. And on top of this idea of a ghost entity, meaning the camera had its own perspective, its own interest, its own point of view. We also wanted to think a lot about, narratively, what the camera would pay attention to or think about as the story interacted with one another. So that's how we began thinking about that. So the camera had to have a literal perspective, had to have a positionality, and a proximity, that made sense to what we're trying to do to keep the truth of what it is that we're doing. So we couldn't create a perspective, let's say, for sake of argument, of the camera on a dolly in the exterior of the car, or trailer, process trailer, or something on the exterior car. We had to think about the car or the ghost entity as the perspective. So that gave us a certain limit, and that limit gave us a certain way to think about, okay, how do we work with this limit? So ultimately, sparing you the details of all the tech and kind of I don't know, like logistics of how we position the camera. We literally got to, we're going to stay in mostly locked frames. We're going to, we end up drilling, I think, about 9 holes into the roof of the car,
Right.
which gave us the ability to move relatively quickly, moving the camera, but also it made us really specify within the shot listing what are the angles, how we're going to create, how we literally manage those certain angles, what those angles say. And then what we also wanted to do, we wanted to make the car feel more dynamic and spacious than it literally is, in a way where it felt like, since this will be the world of the film, we didn't want it to, even though it is a somewhat claustrophobic film and claustrophobic space in a way, we wanted to work with that containment. We still wanted to give a dynamic kind of, because I love, when I get into the nerdy side of why it's also in a car, there is something beautiful about the frame within the car, rectangles and squares and different things like that, windows, all those things are just, to me, aesthetically interesting. So working with all these material, they all coincided to kind of create the feeling of the film actually looks like. And all these things connect to how we were also thinking deeply about emotion, emotion, what we can capture through body language when you're just shoulders and head, basically. How can we create the effects of those feelings with just those which are, it's a lot, there's eyes and all these kind of things that can happen within just that space of a person. And we're thinking about portraiture, the history of portraiture and photography and film. So yeah, some of these things were the elements that we thought a lot about in terms of logistics to kind of create this narrative.
Yeah, and I think the limitation really brings forth a lot of creativity with the angles, because not only do you have mostly those fixed shots, but also surprisingly you have some pans that happen in the film, particularly in the conversation with Booker and his friends in the car. They're really impressive. I wonder, you must have taken out maybe a chair to put the camera inside the car. I'm always thinking, how technically was it possible for you to get around those things? But also, in the means of portraiture, it's interesting how you use the clean and unclean focus to kind of mimic a certain impressionism, let's say, in the scene. I think there's a great dialogue between the visible and the invisible in a way. Our main character is also always kind of an enigma, a foreign in a familiar land. Is LA a new town or is it an old town? When you get into town for the first time, there's a strangeness about it that goes throughout the film that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so touched that you mentioned this part about visibility, because man, we thought so much about this, and I'm feeling really touched. Nicole and Andrew and all my collaborators, we dialogue a lot. We think about these things a lot, and there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of fear here, because we're doing what we can call, I mean, in the grand scheme of film, non-traditional, right? Of course, there's the art house thing, and you know that's a different conversation, but in the grand scheme of film, these things are non-traditional. And we thought a lot about, like, we are not going to see the main character's face for, I think, more than halfway of the movie. He's either, it's behind his head, or there's shadow, or for a quick flash you get to see him, whatever. It's not until I have like this moment more than halfway through the film where we have this 3-angle portrait of him in full daylight, where we have to actually see him. And we thought a lot about this, like, what, is this going to alienate the audience? Is this going to create some kind of, what effect will this have? And I think what we thought about beyond this fear, we thought a lot about the ability, and talks about in terms of visibility, for an audience to be able to project themselves into the character, for them to, in the mundane, sometimes you slip out, you're thinking intensely about the character in one scene, and in that same scene or a different scene, you may think about your own self in that particular setup, because this is a universal story. This is a timeless story. So there's some part of this where it's like, some of the story you don't necessarily need to pay attention to. Dialogues to some degree don't necessarily matter as much in a certain way. You can understand what it feels like to meet up with an old friend and have a certain type of interaction, or family, whatever the case may be. So I wanted the audience to also feel visible and or invisible in certain contexts as well. And then proximity, I think you touched on a thing about camera, and honestly, the literal camera of this was a big part of how we created the film. I saw this film. This is not a burial. This is a resurrection. So I saw that film and I really was curious about like, because it looked like film. There was some elements that felt like film, like 35 or maybe even 16 in the movie. And I just reached out to the director and the cinematographer. I was curious about what film what camera they shot in, and with film stocks, etc. And they told me about the Sony, I believe it's the Venice. And I talked to my cinematographer about this, and he told me, actually, this would be a good idea for using this camera because they have a function on the camera called Rialto mode. And what Rialto mode means basically is, in this particular camera, you can remove the sensor and lens from the body. So which gave us a lot of flexibility to be able to move in certain ways that no other camera will give us, that in terms of a large format camera will be able to give us kind of flexibility. So that's the kind of detail that we were getting into when we were thinking about how we capture all these things, how they all kind of collide to create the film essence. You know what I mean? So and obviously it's a camera that's also good at low light. So Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a great American novel, timeless American novel. And what I liked about that novel is this guy, I remember one of my readings of it, I just underlined and highlighted every use of the term, something had to do with visibility or invisibility. And like in that book, there's so many references that talk about literally, metaphorically, structurally about these themes, visibility. And I thought about that in this film. I was like, how can I use visibility in lots of different ways, literally, metaphorically, and beyond? So darkness, framing, points of view and narrative, all these different things, feeling of dislocation, all these things were ways to kind of play with these themes and this idea. So yeah, the camera was also part of that, and how we use darkness and shadow. So
yeah, it's the idea is really embodied in the film, and like you said, in low light situations, thinking of the camera and how can it resist that exposure is really important.
So, as mentioned previously, Civic was supported by known institutions throughout pre-production and beyond, such as Netflix and Berlinale. And so, how did it take applying to them, and what was the experience working with them to find the story?
Okay, so as you know, those of us listening and sitting here now, I think Berlinale and all these festivals like Rotterdam and Arno, etc. These kind of film festivals, art house they call it. And this other world, right? There's another world where, let's say, Netflix, etc. These are typically what they call, at least in America, commercial or mainstream.
Yeah.
Or what Chantal Ackerman calls the crowds, she knows term. So for me, I bring it back to this interview that kind of summarized the feeling that I wanted to capture. It was Steve McQueen's latest series called Small Acts. In an interview about that show, a series, he said, Steve McQueen, for those of us who have not heard of him, he's a filmmaker, but he spent most of his career working in the museum space as a video art, artist, and he's very successful. However, museums, where most of his work take place, there's a particular audience that comes into those spaces. And there's a completely different audience, let's say on a major network, that what they experience. So one thing he said on an interview, and this might be somewhat of a misquote, but I'm trying to get it as close as I possibly can, was he wanted to make something that his mother could watch. And what I took from that was, yes, there's some responsibility to creating a space, a safe space, a space that your audience is familiar with, to be able to come in and also take part, not in a museum and not in a major film festival where only a certain type of person goes. So I think for my challenge was, I'm interested in art house film. That's where that's what gave me my my spark. However, I don't want to alienate my community. So what I say is I want to be operating on both sides of the fence. So having Berlinale at the same exact time, working with Netflix and Ghetto Film School, having conversations about the script, having conversations about the structure and all these different things in two completely different worlds at the same time, became really typical for how my life is kind of structured. So applying to Berlinale, and thinking about not just audience, but what kind of resources are in that space, and what kind of intellectualism and thinking process. And what I liked about Berlinale is that they think about, it's about the art of the film. It's not about anything else. And we spent a lot of time talking about the material alone without any thought about commercialization or marketability or anything along those lines. However, Netflix, even though we spent a lot of time also on script, it was to angle it to somewhat of some version of understanding from a more marketable, broad, kind of approach. So, but I didn't want
audience.
Target audience, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
it was me at the same exact time, working, let's just say on both sides of the fence. So I spent that's kind of how I spent the development process, or like let's say the final development process before we shot the film, thinking in those spaces.
Yeah, and an interesting question would be, what advice would you give to someone who is thinking of applying to, for example, Berlinale short form station or Netflix, the grant? What did you felt that you extremely needed to have prepared to apply, to approach these institutions?
I think the thing that these institutions, especially Berlinale, I think one thing to be ready for is to be literally just have thought about your film, have thought about not just a script in the sense of like you wrote a script and you have an idea, but thinking about it in a certain level of depth and spending time with it. Getting beyond, let's say, the first few drafts even, and being really familiar with it in a way where there's a journey you still need to go on, and knowing that, like I said, I think we talked about this in one of the first questions, is like collaboration, not necessarily saying that this is necessarily collaboration, although I would call it a collaboration. But it allows yourself to take yourself out of your own echo chamber of development and thinking in your whole process, to be able to open it up to, let's just say, the world, but other minds, and that is a hard process. I think some people like to keep and know everyone's process is different. Mine just so happens to be, I like to embrace the openness and, let's say, collaboration and thoughts and ideas from other outside resources. I think some people, I completely understand too, that isn't their process, and that isn't how they find a way to access a deeper level of their filmmaking. So I think that's also another point. It's like, I laugh at this one Pedro Costa quote. I can't remember what year it's from. Maybe a few years ago. Maybe when the Vidalina's time.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
he was in Rotterdam Film Festival,
yeah,
and you went there. And he said that, like, also I agree with him. This is something kind of carried me as well. I think you mean this, which is when you're writing a film, when you're preparing it, it's like a gift you give in Christmas, right? You don't reveal the surprise, you leave it for Christmas. So, I also understand that kind of frame of mind. But yeah, I was completely thinking about that when you started saying that there are other people who have other methods of collaboration. But yeah. It's a funny one, isn't it?
It's a very funny one. He says never pitch your film. Like, this is a great filmmaker. There's so many examples of filmmakers, from the art house world, like Pedro Costa, or someone in the indie or mainstream area like Paul Thomas Anderson, who don't want to share in a certain way. And I completely understand and respect that. So it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. I don't think everyone should approach it as like, I need to be in this. But it is for a certain type of person who wants to be in incubation with other minds.
Yeah.
And that not, it's not, for me, it was an incredible experience and worthwhile experience. But
Yeah. Would you say that in applying to, for example, the Berlinale, you had to, show proof of having other crew members very early on? Let's say, did you have a producer already? Did you direct photography attached? Was that something that was involved?
No, that Berlinale, and I wanna give them the most love I can, because the person, at least at this time, her name is Sarah. She's so kind, and I think what they care about, what they think about, at least from my perspective, my dialogues with the people that were in my group that year, and also the curators from this, series, but also past series, who are also still involved in certain ways. They are thinking about the story. They're thinking about the concept. They're thinking about where this creator wants to go. And they're thinking more so than that, and they're not necessarily concerned that much with the making, or if it even is going to be made. And you know, that's my perspective. I don't want to say that that's the truth in general for these, you know, people in this program, but I think that's the thing they're concerned with, and they love, and same with me. I love the medium of short form. You know, it is a medium, and it's not necessarily a mini feature. And I think these people are thinking about how are you know, the people that are applying, how are they thinking about that medium? How does this narrative fit into the medium, and how are they working with it in general? I think that's what they're concerned with. I don't think I had listed on my materials anything about producers or collaborators. You know what I'm saying? It was really
Sure.
it was really just about the idea.
Yeah, that's
Almost like a
cool.
sort of mentoring for you to improve for future projects.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
To return a bit more to the visual technique of the film, the visual style of it, I think one of the most striking things is like the flirtation with what's left unseen, as you were already explaining, that the exploration of the visibility and the invisibility. There's the careful blocking, the blurriness, the diffusion in the image. I think it's very, very interesting, and they all work to express the inner world of the character. And so I'm thinking, for example, the first time we're introduced to Booker, as we are in the back of the car, and he's just an unknown figure, that enigma we were talking about. And then when he reunites with the friends, there's these tight shots that blend between the clean and the unclean focus. I also like the beginning with the POV shot. There's the clash between the two aspect ratios that change, which, you know, it's the literal change in perspective that is also figurative. And so, like, these visual ideas, did they come to you? Were the elements that you had already played with in your experimental work, and how much of that work did you bring upon this more narrative form?
Man, I just keep going back to, again, collaboration and dialogue with my team. It's great to be, I think time spent in the material, in the script, in dialogue, thinking about the characters, thinking about the world, backstory, which, you know, to bring it back to our last discussion about the Berlinale experience. I remember one of the they bring on these consultants, let's call them. One of the consultants for me was a script consultant, and she really challenged me. She really wanted me to pin down literal details of the backstory, stuff that wasn't in the script. And, you know, it helped me to kind of in my mind at least literalize like who and what these characters were. And we did a lot of this work in the script before, but then going deeper. You know, I think I'm bringing this up now because it opened up a way to think about, I guess, like, yeah, you know, thinking about like how we then, you know, took what we had from the script and were able to, as I had these kind of more details that weren't in the script, we're able to go with my collaborators and talk deeper and further and further and further into the world and perspective of these characters, how they interact, what they are coming from, and creating these narratives that go beyond the page, which created this, what I like to call truth, I guess, within all the technical aspects. So we're opening up on, you know, this anamorphic kind of perspective when we come into the city, and a certain type of looking, a certain type of observation, let's say, and history with, let's say, film, in terms of what an anamorphic kind of, you know, aspect ratio and does and mean. And then you come, as soon as Booker arrives and his character is present and is starting to interact with his friends, we bring the frame in with this 4:3 kind of aspect ratio, and we change the lens, you know, for the almost all the remainder of the film. What does this mean? You know, I mean, Andrew and I, we talked a lot about this, and you know, certain scenes, and we could talk about like, yeah, like, you know, I remember one of the first blurry shots that we show was after a conversation where Booker's asked, you know, where is it you're from again? And then we cut to a frame of him and we're looking at the outside space of the car, which we don't do that much in a certain way in the film, and he's out of focus. What does that say? What does that give to an audience? What does that allow, in terms of like visibility here, literally speaking, then also what are we allowing again the audience to inquire as they look at the city, in a very mundane part of the city. I mean, this is not like some amazing skyscape. This is like storefronts and I don't know, factory or whatever, is in that, shot. And, so again, how, and then we're thinking about the cut. A lot of these things, we're thinking about what is, as here's what we're looking at, here's what the frame is, and then when we're going to, thinking about all these things in sequence, and a lot of dialogue about how we, what it may or may not mean, what it may or may not open up in conversation and dialogue for the audience, and what it may mean for the character and the narrative. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, but I think this will lead into the kind of our psychology and approach to all these decisions. It goes right on down to color, even how we color a frame, how we think about sound. For me, the approach, generally speaking, for most of the film, there's parts that we slip and play with in different ways, but we started the film out thinking about I wanted to think about anthropology a little bit. Like I want to think about how cinema or film can be, especially in fiction films, can be a tool for anthropology. Can it? I don't know, but we approach it in a way where it's very one-to-one. What you see is what you hear. So as we cut, we're thinking about, okay, sound cuts and what that means for an audience, and color. We thought a lot about what color and how we color it, what it means. So again, I think I was saying the tip of the iceberg in terms of getting into psychology of it, but that's how we, started all these conversations with every different department to think about, how do we make more meaning with the things that are not dialogue, the things that are not, let's say, casting, and how we deepen the meaning through those tools.
I mean, yeah, this actually leads me to another question, which is to do with the sense of place, actually. And because we've been discussing kind of those moments, there's a beautiful moment in the short after T and his friends leave Booker, where there's a tonal shift, I felt, in a way. And all this happiness and rumpus leaves the car, kind of drains the car, and it becomes empty. And you have the landscape of LA, these storefronts that you talk about, the mundane of it, seen through the vehicle and the structure, the architecture of the vehicle, and at the same time, the sound of the voice of the uncle of Brooker kind of coming into him through the phone, longing for his nephew, but he feels a bit disconnected. The interesting thing is he's off screen a whole amount of the time, or like you said, when we do see him in another moment, but it's not at this moment, it's a bit early in the film, he's driving this lady, and we see later on him blurred as that dialect with invisibility. But this moment of the friends going away, the car becoming empty, feeling the mundane, where do I fit? It speaks very truly to that feeling of displacement, really. Where do I fit in this town? Am I the same person? And it was really reminiscent to me as I was watching of Chantal Ackerman's News from Home in a way, which I thought was interesting. And so this leads me to the question, what idea of Los Angeles in its social and geographical tissue of the landscape did you want to capture with what you've shown here through the car? Yeah, so it was regarding that, what idea of LA did you want to capture in all its social and kind of geographical tissue of the landscape? And how did that figure into the creative process of finding the right streets, and why these streets?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're right. It connects to our last discussion about anthropology, and I think early on I thought about how anthropology could factor into this film, and I think yes, connecting again to News from Home, which is a good example of a time capsule, so to speak, of New York City at a certain place in time, and what that means as a film, what film can achieve. Which in some ways I guess is a basic idea, but then I think thinking about it is part of the ability to deepen the meaning here. I think, because I thought about, like, this is LA. There's this film by Simon Lang called The Skywalk Is Gone. It's a short film. And I recommend people who are interested in some of these ideas about what looking at a place may or may not mean. This isn't necessarily a unique idea in film, but I think the skywalk is gone, especially if you watch the trilogy. I think that this film may loosely be connected to. It starts with this scene where a woman is looking at a space in the sky, essentially. What you end up learning is like she's shot because she came back to this part of Taiwan and she hasn't been there in a while. I think maybe she's been in France for a long time or something. There's a vagueness here, but the previous film she was in France. And she's looking and she's realizing like, oh man, everything I knew about this particular corner is changed, and what that shock, that shock feeling might be. And I think we could all kind of relate to this as cities and places modernize. And I think how interesting could it be? I thought about this because those streets are the streets I grew up on. So that's my particular neighborhood and area. And I think about also connected to this conversation we had earlier about Steve McQueen. I want to make a movie my mom could watch, and I think the mom part is metaphor for community. And I think about like how interesting would it be for hopefully an audience in the future, let's say 10, 20 years from now, look back at this film and someone have a feeling of remembering a place, remembering that corner, that storefront, or that whatever, and how that also folds itself back into the narrative of this film. A film about someone who went away for a long time and come back and things are different. Things are changed, whether it be interpersonally through friends and family or through itself or through literal kind of geographic landmarks. So I think that's why anthropology and films like News from Home or also Chantal's The Est and stuff like that really, really, really have done something to me in the way I think about film. That goes for geography and place, but also how we cast, what kind of language we use, what kind of rhythm and tone, what kind of wardrobe we think about. That I think I want to think a lot about that and in a way and to capture a feeling and essence of something that we can, and hopefully in the future, look back in some form of appreciation.
Film is shot, as you said, with this sense of geometry, with the squares and rectangles. So
yeah,
it really adds to the sense of calmness and balance, I suppose, which is a nice idea, I think, to look back on these places with that sort of peace as well.
Man,
which is,
but that word specifically was exactly. I'm really touched that you said that word, peace, because it's essential. It's so important to me. The feeling that you're talking about. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just also want to say that how we framed it, and also even thinking again about edit and sound, removing elements that could cause a certain level of, let's say, fear, anxiety. And to be frank, if you put a certain type of character, let's say Black characters from South Central LA, and you had a car and driving into a film, typically speaking, and this has happened, through the entire process of writing to the production and edit, people have a fear, someone is going to get harmed in some kind of way. There's going to be a certain type of violence, almost to a guarantee. So I thought, there's part of this where I'm just interested in films that you can feel at ease and peace, and we can talk about those examples, but there's another layer there when you add let's say cultural elements and ethnicity to the same, you add that to the equation, you there's a different type of expectation, at the end of it. So yes, peace and rest and this calmness that you're talking about is still extremely important to me and almost central to one of those themes. Is migration, there's identity, there's visibility. I don't know if I'm calling it a theme, but like, yeah, peace and rest, I think, is part of one of the ways I want to approach my filmic style.
So we understand that Civic is the first film in a trilogy of sorts. The second follow-up, You Do Not Exist, having already been shot, and then the third, Now You Hear Me God. So, what could you tease about them? Do you have any idea of where and when our listeners will be able to see them, whether in festivals or streaming, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess I'll give you guys more detail because this conversation has been so generous, and I really appreciate every one of these
Thank you.
questions. Deep thinkers. We're working with deep thinkers here.
Deep
So
thinkers,
yeah,
The Guardian.
YD&E/You Do Not Exist is a film that, yes, we shot before Civic, actually. It's a film that was made I think what I can say about it is I wanted to make and again, I told you about my themes. My themes are all in this film. It's a what I call a reverse travelogue. It's or an inverted travelogue, maybe sometimes I say. It's thinking about Chris Marker. It's thinking about La Jetée. It's thinking about Sans Soleil. It's thinking about how a character who hasn't traveled, who hasn't been anywhere, is thinking about the world at large, thinking about, creating, their own narrative about places, famous places, places that maybe a lot of travelers have been, London, Paris, and, Rio, wherever, thinking about these different, worlds, so to speak, and creating their own kind of impression and interpretation without having been there. So opposite of a travelogue where someone goes to a place and accounts for the observations. So, again, this is thinking about invisibility. I think you can see ways in which that it's approaching that. It's a film that's shot in 3 formats of black and white, film, 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, and there's still photography there as well. And I'll stop there to say that's kind of the general kind of structure, of the film. And then the other part of the trilogy is a film called Now Hear Me Good. It's a film about exile, right? So we have Civic, which is a film about someone who left and came back. You Do Not Exist /YD&E is a film about someone who has never gone anywhere. They've never left home. They've never traveled. And then Now Hear Me Good is about someone who, the classic story of someone leaving, and going somewhere else and making a new place their home. And that film is in the, I guess, early stages of development. However, we did just get our initial funding, or the foundation of the funding, at least for the film. It is a short film, and in the fray, as all you three and a lot of listeners know, once you start making a film and once you start getting funding for a film, there's a lot of moving parts and stress, and
Yeah.
some things have to become realized, and sometimes things becoming realized is a kind of heartbreak in a way. Making the things become reality takes away from the dream, which we have to get there. But so yeah, these 3 films, and I'm hoping that they will be accepted into the world in some form or fashion. If it gets to play in festivals again, that'll be a blessing. If I get an audience again for these films, it'll be a huge blessing. I think I need, and I think, what was it, Duchamp? Is it the viewer finishes the work? I wanted to get to that level, but that is that's my goal. But I think the thing before that, I really just want to think about how I can spend the time I have in making these films wisely, in terms of thinking about the medium and thinking about all the elements of writing to technical things, and how can we create the truth in each part of those elements. How can I walk towards that first, and then if the audience will accept me, what kind of dialogue can happen after that.
And speaking of the fact that it's a short film, I think the final scene really helped to build the depth of the character, which I think was very interesting, because it's not that easy to build, to really get a sense of the depth of a character in a short film format. And to me, at least, it was a scene where I really thought that this character had something else going on.
I think we thought a lot about that with I think structure again, thinking because there's such little time in a short, I guess by structure. So it's like, how do we create that depth that you're talking about? How do we get a feeling? And I think focusing on that before larger, more specific types of narrative things was my way in. So I think I should say this too, like, this trilogy is a prism. They're all going to feature some character named Booker. They will, likely all feature, so far they all feature Barrington Darius as this character, so the same face and body and voice. However, I don't know if they're the same character, and I want to keep that open. And when we think about the depth that you're talking about, like how do each one of these films, and I think the reason why this could probably, why this interests me, this character name and casting, is because thinking about how circumstances will change the identity, how migration or non-migration will change or can influence your identity. And to create, hopefully, what you're saying about being able to go deeper in a character in a short amount of time, so.
As far as this Barrington goes, I think it was really well cast. So I'd work with
Thank you
him
so
again.
Yeah, but the way you describe it, it's sort of like creating like a tapestry of a human being that is like, I don't know, it's like all these experiences are shaping him, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same person, but you can, I mean, again, the way you describe it, it feels like you can project that into him, and sort of with 3 individual shorts, you sort of build a cohesive thing. I don't know if that's the intention or not.
Yeah, it's my intention, I don't know why I started thinking about trilogies. I think it was maybe it was Kiarostami. I don't know, like his, what was it, Kokiri trilogy, and there's so many great trilogies in novels.
And also, I was
Yeah.
thinking about Three Colors. It's similar in the way that the emotions connect the films, but the characters differ. You may find the earlier protagonists in posterior films, but they always change. So I think it's another example, yeah. And that was the latest from Dwayne LeBlanc, folks. We would like to thank his presence here today. He is truly an excellent filmmaker. Have a look into his work once out on streaming platforms. If you're a filmmaker running the festival marathon, feel free to send us a message for an interview as well. We would love to promote your work. Don't forget to subscribe, share this interview, or simply give us a like. That's how our podcast can grow ever more groovy. And if you're on YouTube and want to see more interviews like this, check out this next video right here. Thank you for listening and see you next time.